A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, Greg Bondar back with us today, National Director of Christian Voice Australia, a national think tank and advocacy group for families, for liberty and for faith. Greg Bondar, a special welcome back to 2020.
Good morning, Neil, and thank you very much for being able to talk to you. So thank you, Neil.
Hey, Greg, I mentioned in the intro just a short few moments ago, this terminology we'll often hear about being a cultural Christian. You've been thinking through this issue. You've done some research on what this means and who claims to be a cultural Christian and who doesn't. What does it mean to be a cultural Christian?
Now, that is a great question because it's a term that I'm seeing pop up more and more each day. What is a cultural Christian? Well, Neil, quite frankly, you and I have both heard of the weekend Christians, those that only come to church on a Saturday, Sunday, or maybe a Saturday. You've heard of fair weather Christians. These are people that generally only want to know Christ in a period of crisis or when things are really good. They're not so much interested. And then also we now have cultural Christians. Neil, one of the most famous cultural Christians goes back to the early 2000s. That was Richard Dawkins, who he identified as a cultural Christian. But Neil, what does this actually mean? And this is something we need to really try and fathom out because people are trying to claim to be cultural Christians every day. So it's a topic that I'm very much interested in.
Yes, well, you've got the sort of Christian who will claim to be a Christian. Maybe they'll turn up at church at Easter and Christmas, or the C and E, the church, the Christmas and Easter type Christian. I mean, is that sort of person a cultural Christian? How do you get into some nitty gritty here in actually making some sort of a definition?
Yeah, that's a good question because just recently Elon Musk, the tech mogul, Tesla cars and what have you, and space rocket, recently was interviewed by Jordan Peterson, where he said, I am not particularly a religious person. I do believe that the teachings of Jesus are good and wise. There's a tremendous wisdom in turning the other cheek, he said. But quite frankly, he also finished off by saying, a big believer in the principles of Christianity, I am, he said, and I probably identify as a cultural Christian. Well, Neil, even Satan believes in God. so we've got to be very careful when we start talking about ourselves as a cultural Christian. And I think Elon Musk, of course, has done what a lot of people do, picked out a few passages from the Bible, applied it to themselves and say, oh, this is not bad. But Neil, we've got to make sure that we have a biblical worldview and a biblical perspective of what Christianity really is.
Okay, so you've got this thought of cherry picking. I'll take that little bit there and I'll take this little bit over here. That makes me feel good. And leave that other hard stuff aside, or actually don't explore deep enough so that you get a well-rounded contextual type of understanding of what it is to be a Christian, to be a follower of Jesus. Is that a fair way of saying, that's what a lot of people tend to do?
Yeah, I think you're on the ball there, Neil, because you see, Musk was saying that his beliefs could be best described as the religion of curiosity, the religion of greater enlightenment. Well, this is shades of Hare Krishna, enlightenment and what have you. But Neil, let's not forget that he hasn't found or is yet to discover that Jesus is the real truth. And I think that's the real issue that we as Christians need to make sure that other people that claim to be cultural Christians don't fall into the same trap as saying, well, I believe in that, but not this. So you can't make the Bible, you can't make the Bible say what you want it to. You've got to read it as it is. And a lot of people, Neil, unfortunately have said, yeah, I agree with that part of the Bible, but not this part of the Bible. Well, that's getting out of context. And I think, we've got to make sure that the Bible is the inerrant word of God, Neil, and that's the real issue for me.
The thought that somehow or other, if you cherry pick this little bit and that little bit and leave other bits aside, you develop opinions. Those opinions might not necessarily be right opinions. And somehow or other, you've got to be able to dig a little bit deeper, or you've got to find a mentor who can help keep you on track. Would that be a fair way of saying, well, this is why you need pastors, this is why you need leaders in church, that's why you need mature people, or people who might be, gifted with that teaching gift that you might hear about? This would all be a part of the sort of support you can find in church life.
Yeah, absolutely, Neil. And I think you made the point about opinions. You see, when we're talking morality and when we're talking about ethics, you can't have 8 billion people with different ethics and moral views. There's only one that I rely on, that's the biblical worldview. So this is where I think people like Musk, Richard Dawkins, all try and cherry pick the Bible for their own benefit or for their own criticism. You've got to be committed to a biblical worldview, the Word of God, the truth that Jesus is the truth. And I think we've got to make sure that we as Christians reinforce that, both at home, in the church, and in public life as well, Neil. So I really worry about this cultural Christian term because I think it's going to grow and grow. And I think we've got to be very, very careful how we come to interpret people's statements about being a cultural Christian.
Just before we move on from this topic, any thoughts from you, Greg, around if you're saying, well, actually, what you're describing looks a little bit like my faith. Is there something you might have some thought, insight, advice, even for that person who says, well, you know what, I've been struggling with this. I don't want to be a cultural Christian. I want to be, the real deal. I want to have a certain authenticity. I want to be a Christ follower and take things deeper. Any thoughts or insight into how you might make a change?
Yeah, look, Neil, I do actually, and it would be a far longer discussion than we're having now. But, Matthew 7:24-27 comes to mind, where we've got to decide as a Christian where we want to build our house. If you want to build it on sand, you're going to end up being a cultural Christian because you're not on firm foundation. And I think you've got to make sure that if you want the truth, then you take a biblical worldview, and there's nothing else but the inerrant word of God, and that's the Bible, Neil. But quite frankly, people need to really decide where they want to build their biblical faith, on what foundation, sand or rock or water. You've got to decide, Neil, because Matthew 7 makes it clear we've got to build it on firm foundations now.
So building your house on the rock, building your house on the sand, and I guess the cultural Christian is sort of leaning towards the rock, but probably still standing on the sand. So there's some good insight there. Hey, another big issue that has been plaguing Christian thought, perhaps since the start of the Paris Games, thinking about how Christians respond to that gender controversy in the women's Olympic boxing. Give us your insight here.
Neil, this is a perennial problem, and it's going to continue to be a problem unless we start to make some firm, principled decisions. Look, everyone's heard about this. On the 1st of August, the boxing match between Angela Carini and Algeria's Imaine Khalif caused a lot of stir, because what happened, quite frankly, Neil, is that this particular match, Carini, the Italian boxer, female, lasted a mere 45 seconds, and then she ended up removing herself from the match because she said, this is not fair. And what's happening here is that we've got a boxer that claims to be a female, is a male, and genetically we have a real issue because the IOC has failed to look after the health and safety, in my view, of women's sport. So this is a real issue, and it's not going to go away. I think it'll continue to go on because, you see, what's happening here is that women's sport is once again in the spotlight.
And this is one of those anomalies, isn't it, in the debate, because this particular boxer is not a transgender boxer. This is a person with a disorder. And I know that for many, many years, from time to time, this has come up in more a theoretical conversation that there are people that do have some disorders that are in the middle of where you might say it's like a grey area between the black and the white. So making sense of this, though, being able to stand on a biblical and a biological truth, is there some way we can connect the dots here and as a Christian have a view as to, what makes a male, what makes a female, what makes that middle ground disorder that certainly needs our compassion rather than our condemnation?
Yeah, now look, quite frankly, I've got to tell you that the decision was made by the Boxing Federation that there was no question that genetically Khalif was a male. And the disorder that you speak about is quite frankly a disorder. And I think we as Christians need to pray about that. We need to pray about what this person will use his particular skills for. But at the moment, in this particular boxing match, there was a biological advantage for Khalif. There was no question about that. So what we as Christians need to do is, do we stand up for our biblical and biological truth? I think we have to. But at the same time, we have to have compassion and feeling for this particular disorder. That's not to say that we agree with the method that the competition is proceeding on, male, female. What we've got to be doing is praying and engaging. But at the same time, we need to pray for wisdom, discernment, for decision makers that take into account the vulnerability of women going up against men in a biological sense. And Neil, let's keep praying, but I think we have to stand up for the biblical truth here on male versus female sport, Neil. And so I'm really following this because it's going to come up more and more as we talk.
And you know what? There may be a positive in all of this, Greg, because as you'll know on this program, we've talked for a long time about the XX and the XY chromosomes and all of the mainstream media coverage of what's happened in the, what is a woman, man-woman debate has all been around feelings. Who feels like a woman today? Who feels like a man today? At least now the whole world is actually exposed to this thought that you can determine the sex of a person, XX or XY chromosomes. And yes, there's still going to be some grey areas when there are disorders, but that sounds like a fairly solid foundation on which you can actually make this distinction.
Yeah, absolutely, Neil. And, I continue to say that, even with the opening ceremony, I don't want to go into that now because you've covered it many times, but, I have righteous anger there, Neil. I have righteous anger. And same thing with this particular boxing match. But you know what, Neil? Both of these events have put the Bible and Christianity in the spotlight. Now, that's got to be a good thing because God works in mysterious ways. And if it was God's way of getting Christianity to be debated, the Bible in perspective, then maybe, the perfect creator has a mission for all of us to say, all right, how do we as Christians handle this? So, you know what? The Bible and Christianity is on the lips of everybody internationally. So maybe it's a good thing from that perspective. But quite frankly, I am bearing a lot of righteous anger, Neil.
Okay. And you know what? There's wisdom too in the thought that when there is controversy, sometimes the temptation is to disengage. Oh, I'm not going to watch that. Or, oh, that's not what I, am into. But there might actually be real wisdom in taking the opportunity and seeing the resolution of how you can stabilize your own thinking on it and come down to a point of a biblical and biological reference and use that to actually engage in the challenging controversies. Hey, another quick one to touch on. You've been looking at churches that are closing, the rate that we're planting new churches in Australia and perhaps around the world. What are your thoughts on the difference in closing churches? And I know that there's some statistics that are older and there probably is not an accurate reflection of what's actually happening so far as churches. But what are your thoughts on churches that have been closing in Australia?
Yeah, thank you, Neil. Look, I have dug up some older stats regarding Christianity, churches. I mean, currently, the last count I had was there were about 11,400 churches in Australia at the moment, and they are closing. And and you would well know that the last census in government that the government held was very indicative that Christianity decreased from 12.2 million, around about 52%, to about 11.1 million in 2016 and in 2021. So now what we've got here is that Christianity is on the decline, but we must be very careful in measuring that, because the actual census doesn't require you to answer that question anymore. So, if people aren't answering it, we don't get a real reflection. The point I want to make here, Neil, is that I had the opportunity to visit St Kilda Presbyterian Church in Victoria about a week ago. And I went in there and wow, Neil, the grand old church, wonderful stained windows, grand pipe organ, wonderful ornate pews. It's now going to be either sold or developed. It's worth about $3 million, Neil. So really, I'm so heartbroken, and I'm hoping one of your listeners might want to buy a church, Neil.
All right, so there's a real estate advertisement coming from you today, Greg, because the church is on the market in St Kilda, and it's an older church. Give us a quick little description. What does it look like? You just never know who might be listening and saying, well, maybe we can jump in and help to preserve this piece of wonderful architecture. Give us a picture of it, what it looks like.
Yeah, no, look, as I said, it's an old grand church. It's got the steeples, it's got the old bluestone, the brickwork, it's got still got the lovely gardens, and it presents as one of those, old sort of Gothic churches in many ways. But look, Neil, when you get inside, the stained glass windows, the pipe organ, the pews, I hate that. I said to my friend that was down there, the treasurer of the church, I said to him, look, if I won Lotto, not that I buy Lotto, Neil, I would buy this church and do something with it, But quite frankly, and I have to tell you this, at the same time I met with a young bloke that came back from the United States to Melbourne, and his job was to plant churches. Now, the real issue is, Neil, here is that, as I mentioned to him, that unfortunately churches are closing faster than they're being planted. And reasons for that is, neighbourhood demographics, dwindling attendees, not enough money, ageing buildings, whatever. But Neil, they are closing. Churches are rationalising. And I hate to see lovely churches like this go, but I'm told that if nobody buys it, it'll end up being a block of units. Neil?
And probably lots of us listening will know a church in your community that's been changed and redesigned to be, those sorts of things, a block of units, or somebody's decided to build their dream home in an old church. The fact that there are old churches like the one you're talking about, and when you paint that picture, I'm thinking that when those builders who built that church, they probably built it with the thought that, hey, this might be a smaller version of those big cathedrals, but we'd like to think this is going to be here for 1,000 years. And, they take upkeep to keep them there. Some will argue, I only want a modern sort of a church because I want to portray a Christianity that's modern and cutting edge with contemporary society. But both are necessary, aren't they? That heritage as well as the sort of new and modern cutting edge church that lots of people want to be involved in. But both are important.
Absolutely, Neil. And don't forget that a church is people, not buildings. But the actual building here is the architecture, the history, the actual, reverence of it all. And I think it would be a shame, Neil, that we lose these types of churches. And I do hope that the St Kilda Presbyterian Church, somebody buys it or somebody leases it out to plant a new church, whatever the case may be. But I really want to make sure that, we try and hold on to these sort of churches because they are closing quicker than you can think. And, I just believe that the National Church Lifesaver Survey showed that 1,200 churches had closed since 1991, in particular in Victoria. So now, what can we do? I'm not going to do a fundraiser, but if anybody's got 3 or 4 million and wants to buy a church, please contact me.
And Greg, you could get creative here and say, wouldn't it be wonderful if someone came up with a creative way of turning these historic churches into what might be a monument to the past, but also fitted out with the latest technological wizardry, excusing the terminology there, to make things just fabulous for the way that people can worship in these older worship spaces. So somehow or other, some attention to how that historic worship space works in a contemporary environment, because, you know, if it can last for 1,000 years, we've got generations to move through there, and modern things and modern thinking, they are going to come and go, and there's going to be something new even in the times to come. Hey, Greg Bondar, great insights today across all of those issues. Greg is National Director of Christian Voice Australia, national think tank, advocacy group for families, liberty and faith. And to connect with Greg in his role at Christian Voice Australia, christianvoiceaustralia.blog, christianvoiceaustralia.blog. Greg, thanks so much for another great update today on 2020.
God bless. Thank you, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.